11th of March, 2011. Okuma, Fukushima, Japan. A country built to withstand disaster is about to face one of its greatest tests. A powerful earthquake, a devastating tsunami, and a nuclear crisis that will change lives forever. At the center of it all is the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, a facility designed for safety, but not prepared enough. Global catastrophes like this are not born in a single moment. They are built. Let's rewind the clock and revisit events as we count down to disaster. At 2:46 p.m., the ground begins to shake. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake strikes off Japan's northeast coast. One of the most powerful ever recorded. Buildings sway violently. Roads split. Power lines collapse. Across the region, people brace themselves. Inside the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, emergency systems activate immediately. Reactors shut down. Control rods are inserted. The nuclear reaction stops. For a moment, everything works as designed. But the danger is not over. Because less than an hour later, the ocean arrives. A massive tsunami races toward the coastline, with waves rising as high as 15 meters, crashing over seawalls and swallowing entire towns. What follows will become the worst nuclear disaster since the Chernobyl disaster. But this story didn't begin with the earthquake or the wave. It began years earlier. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant was constructed in the 1970s along Japan's Pacific coast. It was operated by Tokyo Electric Power Company, and it was part of Japan's push toward nuclear energy. Reliable, efficient, essential for a growing economy. The plant was designed to withstand earthquakes, but tsunamis posed a different challenge. For years, scientists and engineers warned that larger waves were possible along this coastline. Historical records suggested that devastating tsunamis had struck the region before. Some estimates projected waves exceeding 10 meters, yet the plant's seawall stood at just 5.7 meters. Inside the facility, backup diesel generators were installed to power cooling systems in an emergency, but they were placed in low-lying areas vulnerable to flooding. Internal studies raised concerns, and reports warned that a sufficiently large tsunami could disable these critical systems. But action was delayed.
In retrospect, having the diesel backup generators in the basement lower than the wall was a mistake. But people forget there was a tsunami wall in place already, which was something like 5 meters high, which was there exactly for this sort of scenario, to stop a tsunami wave coming over the top. The problem is that this tsunami was the biggest tsunami from the biggest earthquake. So instead of the wall needing to be 5 meters tall, it should have been 15 meters tall.
Upgrades were considered too costly, too complex, too unlikely to be necessary. And so, the plant continued operating. A known vulnerability left exposed. we knew something was wrong. Warnings did not stop, and seismologists continued to study the region. Their conclusions remained consistent, that a large tsunami was not just possible, it was inevitable. Within Tokyo Electric Power Company, internal assessments acknowledged the risk, and simulations showed that waves higher than the seawall could strike the plant. Flooding scenarios were modeled, failures were predicted, but decisions stalled. Protective measures were debated, postponed, and re-evaluated as Japan's nuclear industry had long been viewed as safe. A model of technological precision, and regulators worked closely with operators. In some cases, too closely. A culture of reassurance took hold, and the belief that systems were strong enough, that safeguards would hold, and the worst-case scenario was unlikely. And so, warnings became paperwork. Risks became theoretical, and in the end, nothing changed.
TEPCO, the operators, had some criticism at the beginning for maybe not being as immediately open with their data as they might have been.
March 11, 2011, 2:46 p.m. The earthquake hits at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Reactors shut down automatically. Cooling systems activate. Backup generators come online. For a moment, the system holds. Then, walls of water crash over the plant's defenses. Seawater floods the site. Backup generators are submerged. They fail, and power is lost. Without power, cooling systems shut down. Inside the reactors, heat begins to rise. Fuel rods, still intensely hot, begin to overheat. Water levels dropped, hydrogen gas forms, and the pressure inside the reactor builds. Operators scramble to respond, and emergency procedures are initiated. But systems are failing faster than they can be restored. Communication breaks down, and because of this, decisions are delayed.
It might have been possible under other circumstances to bring up emergency diesel generators, for example, but it was not possible because of the communications problems, the faults on the road. So they were really in trouble. They hadn't got external power, the emergency power had gone down, and they needed, for the 3 reactors that were operating at the time of the earthquake, they needed to keep those reactors cool. And you can see from that they faced a big problem.
As time continues to slip away, temperatures inside the reactors climb to critical levels. Then, hydrogen blasts rip through reactor buildings.
Today's explosion in a nuclear plant in Fukushima, Japan, destroyed the building that houses the plant's reactor, triggering a radiation leak and fears of a nuclear meltdown.
Concrete walls are torn apart. Radiation begins to escape.
The reason that the reactors were vented, which caused, of course, a release of significant amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere, that was made not to release those radioactive materials. It was done to release the buildup of hydrogen pressure in the reactor. If that is not done, there is a possibility that you could blow up the whole reactor core. If you blow the pressure vessel up, then the entire reactor core is then open to the atmosphere. And then all of the radioactive material, in principle, could be released. So it is a sensible option to an impossible problem.
What began as a natural disaster has now become a nuclear crisis. And it is spiraling out of control.
When I arrived there and when the Nuclear Reform Monitoring Committee started, we didn't find a real safety culture at all. We found an efficiency culture. The idea was to generate as much power as possible. There wasn't an issue about whether it was done with safety procedures or not. It was efficiency.
In the days that follow, the scale of the disaster becomes undeniable as multiple reactors melt down. As radiation is released into the atmosphere and ocean, more than 150,000 people forced to evacuate. Entire towns abandoned, homes left behind, lives interrupted overnight. As investigations begin, a deeper truth emerges. The disaster was not simply the result of an earthquake and tsunami. It was a failure of preparation, a failure of oversight, and a failure of accountability. Reports conclude that both Tokyo Electric Power Company and government regulators failed to act on known risks. Warnings were ignored. Precautions were delayed. Safety measures were insufficient. The system that was meant to protect people did not.
The problem with Fukushima Daiichi is that basically no power, no emergency equipment. So under those circumstances, you have to take decisions as to if you do this and release radioactive gases, which were clearly not a desirable situation, but if you had allowed the pressure to build up to levels whereby it ruptured the pressure vessel, then it could have been even worse. So it was a difficult decision, obviously, for the operators to make, but clearly they did the right decision because the pressure vessels were not ruptured.
Public trust begins to collapse. Protests spread across Japan, and communities small and large demand answers. They demand accountability. Because this was not just a natural disaster, it was preventable.
It's true that the Japanese government, at least in the initial response from TEPCO, the operators, had some criticism at the beginning for maybe not being as immediately open with their data as they might have been. But actually, I can't blame them for that. I think the crisis on the ground, the crisis of having this scenario where all of the alarms are going off, the power is cut, the diesel generators are not working, you've got to check all the monitors are there. The worst thing would be to give out wrong information. If you give out wrong information, then people will become cross about that. So checking it, revalidating it, checking it again, it's probably not the worst thing to do. But people were worried. People wanted the information right here, right now.
This was an accident that could have been prevented if the regulators had been doing their job. So under those circumstances, politicians are really not going to survive very long. The decommissioning operations at Fukushima Daiichi will go on for decades, if not longer. 40 years might be a good objective. Personally, I would, given what I know about from other sites of the problems of decommissioning, that may be somewhat optimistic, but we have to see. Fukushima Daiichi is not going to be operational again. There's no way that it's going to be operational. It's just not going to be possible.
The consequences of Fukushima continue long after the headlines fade. Large amount of land remains contaminated, and entire areas are still restricted. Homes stand empty. Communities remain displaced. Families separated from the places they once called home.
안 된다, 안 된다って国で言ってて、とてもそうだかもしれないけど、だけども、
The government said we were safe.
まさかこんなのと思わなかったな。
Now I blame myself for ever having trusted them.
The cleanup effort is immense, and decommissioning the plant will take decades. The cost is measured in hundreds of billions, but the true cost is harder to quantify. Lost livelihoods, lost communities, lost trust.
윤석열 정부는 더 늦기 전에 핵오염수 해양 투기에 반대하는
For many, life will never return to what it was before. As Japan begins to reconsider its reliance on nuclear energy. Because of this, safety standards are strengthened, policies are rewritten. But for those affected, these changes come too late. Because while systems can be improved and lessons can be learned, some consequences cannot be reversed.
In my opinion, somewhat unfairly, this was a once in a lifetime horror event, Hollywood-style tsunami coming over, the worst possible case scenario you could imagine. And the bottom line is, to our knowledge, not one person has died associated with direct radiation exposure from Fukushima. So one could argue that the TEPCO did everything as well as they could possibly have done. There was no textbook for this. There was no history of how you go about sorting out an event like this. And if you're doing stuff in the unknown in real time, maybe it's like the Apollo 13 of nuclear issues, really.
The Fukushima nuclear disaster stands as a warning. Disasters are not always sudden. They are often built over time. Through decisions, through delays, through ignored warnings, until one day there is no turning back.
Japan, of course, has the horrifying history of being the only country where nuclear weapons have actually been used against it. So that is a core part of their national memory. So it's not at all surprising that anything to do with radioactivity releases or nuclear releases is going to have a much deeper psychological effect on the Japanese society than it would in any community.